In the past, sects have been associated with mass suicides and their members ending up in prison. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to give an outstanding definition of what a sect is, and you're going to be able to explain why sects are often short-lived. If you stick around to the end of the video, you're also going to get those top evaluations you need to get an outstanding mark. Sects are just one type of religious organisation, so watch my other videos on religious organisations to complete the topic. Tom from the sociologytutor.com here. Check out my website, hit the subscribe button, let's get started. A sect is a type of organisation which has very strict demands on its members. So to join a sect, you usually have to change your lifestyle in significant ways, maybe give up possessions, even relationships. So there's a very high demand. There's going to be a very powerful, charismatic leader. There will be a single leader who, it comes from their personality. The sect is about them. So there's a charismatic leadership, there's strong demands on members. There's also an us and them mentality. So sects often see society as entirely, wrong, and that the sect has the monopoly of truth, and people who aren't in the sect are not to be sort of associated with, and society is flawed. Now they tend to attract people from disprivileged backgrounds, so people who are marginalised in society due to racism, economic inequality, it could be gender as well. Stark and Bainbridge talk about the sectarian cycle. So let's think about how this happens. The first stage of a sect forming is there's a schism with an established church. Now a schism is a word for a breakaway or a gap sort of forming. And what tends to happen is the underprivileged members of a church are unhappy with the message because the leaders of the church, so an established religion, when I say church, that's what I mean. So it could be Christianity, it could be Buddhism, any established religion. The underprivileged members are unhappy with the way the church hierarchy is explaining their message. It's too conservative. It doesn't offer radical change. So there's a gap and people pull away. What then happens is you have the initial fervour, which is the period where the charismatic leader is, leading the group and placing high demands on them. So this is when the group will be forming. They'll be at their most radical at this point. They're opposing society in a big way. They're separating themselves from it, perhaps, moving to a different location, creating their own community. The next stage is something called denominalization. And what this is referring to is that the group begins to cool off slightly. So the group may actually be successful in business. So financially, they're not under as much pressure. So they're not as sort of angry with society. Their rejection of society isn't as strong. And they might start becoming more organised and more formalised at this point. So the initial fervour has declined somewhat. And the next stage then is establishment. And this is where they are, a fully established sect, and their rejection of society may be less extreme or slightly less extreme at this point. And what actually might happen at this stage is another schism. So you might find, because they've become slightly more mainstream, is some members, again the underprivileged members of the sect, may feel that the group has lost its radicalness and they go off and form their own sect. So that's the sectarian cycle. So it goes through those stages. Obviously it's not going to be a perfect explanation of every sect, but that's what Stark and Bainbridge say tends to happen to a sect. So the key thing to remember is a sect forms out of a group that are unhappy with the direction of a mainstream church. Niebuhr says sects either die out or they become a denomination within a generation. So they either no longer exist, they die out, or they become formalised into a denomination within 20 or 30 years. The first reason they may die out is the charismatic leader dies, or in some cases often they're put in prison or something like that. Once the charismatic leader goes, it's very hard for the sect to continue. So in that circumstance, they'll die out. Final reason it might die out is because of the problem of socialising the next generation. So you can imagine a couple, they join a sect together, they have children. When those children grow up or they're teenagers, they leave it. It's too radical, the demands placed on them are too high, and it's too outside of society. So again, the sect will die out. Protestant ethic effect. Now, what tends to happen is sects organise a large number of marginalised people into a community, and they can actually be successful. Financially their lives improve, materially they're not struggling as much anymore, they're less marginalised, there's less opposition to society itself. And what happens with that is the sect loses its radicalness, and actually it cools down effectively. That's one of the phrases you can use, and it becomes a denomination. Now, the key person you can use to criticise this view that sects will either die out or become a denomination is Wilson. Wilson argues that is not always the case, and in fact there are many sects that become what he calls established sects. These are sects that are effective at socialising the next generation of children into the beliefs, and therefore they continue over many generations. They don't die out or become a denomination after about 20 or 30 years. A good example of this are the Mormons in America. However, Wilson does say this is going to become increasingly difficult in a globalised world where it's increasingly hard with the internet and with the changes to sort of communities that we're seeing. It's increasingly hard for a sect to keep themselves completely separate from society, in which case it'll be more difficult for them to maintain the strict way of life, their strict ideas and the us and them mentality they've got.